Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. R.R. Virdi is on the show today, and if you want to hear an author talk about some really complex ideas on how they write and structure their books and where the ideas come from, this is the episode for you. I was consistently blown away by so many of the things that Ronnie told us about. If you have not liked the show, followed the show, reviewed, please do so. We'd really appreciate it. All right, Ronnie's waiting for us. Let's make our way over to the bridge. Born and raised in Northern Virginia, R.R. Virdi is a two-time Dragon Award finalist, Nebula Award finalist, and USA Today best-selling author. He is the author of the urban fantasy series The Grave Report and The Books of Winter, as well as the epic fantasy novel The First Binding. His love of classic cars drove him to work in the automotive industry for many years before he realized he'd do a better job of maintaining his passion if he stayed away from customers. We definitely have to hear about that. How are you, Ronnie?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, we're super happy to have you. Ronnie is R.R. Virdi, writer of a new book that's coming out that we're going to talk a lot about. And I do kind of want to start things off by what's in the background while I see you here.
Oh,
Stark, Lannister.
and Martell. Yeah.
Oh
So
yeah.
whose side are you on?
Uh, that's really hard because I found reasons to love all the different houses, at least for their portrayals. Obviously, not necessarily their morals, but I really, I mean, who doesn't like House Stark? I mean, they were definitely portrayed as the good guys, super noble. All the main characters that you want to resonate with traditionally are with them. But I do have a love affair for the Martells only for how Dorne is portrayed specifically in the books. We see so much more of their culture. It's so different. They have a lot more of like a Spanish Basque kind of lifestyle. And it just seems it's just there's a certain romanticism about the way that they're shown in the books. Other scenes we never got to see in the show that I really love about them.
I was just going to say, yeah, I agree that that portrayal of Dorne, it was like a breath of fresh air in the books as well, too. It really something that rejuvenated, I think, the whole setting and storytelling. So yeah, totally.
I imagine the Game of Thrones was quite an inspiration for you then.
Uh, to a degree, I came to it a little bit later in fantasy after I found Robert Jordan, who I found after Tolkien. But I came to fantasy like pre-teens, teens after originally urban fantasy. That's what got me more into SFF was urban fantasy in elementary school. The Dresden Files books had just come out, I think, when I was leaving elementary school last year, and a lot of booksellers were pushing them. It got me into the series, and then Buffy happened around the same time. So young teenager, there was like this giant urban fantasy cultural boom happening with Butcher after Laurel K. Hamilton, and then the TV shows Buffy, Angel coming out, um, and then Supernatural a few years later. And I didn't find Game of Thrones until like mid to late teens after I worked my way backwards to more traditional fantasy.
Very cool. So we are here to talk about The First Binding. How about you tell our listeners about the book?
Yeah. So the first binding is sort of a love letter to comparative storytelling and mythology, both of things which I'm really passionate about. And growing up, I got introduced to a lot of the same myths that most people do, the Western myths. Like you read the Odyssey, you read the Iliad, you read a lot about the Greek tragedies. And it wasn't until I got older and I was able to get more into my own culture that I'm from, mostly South Asian, and then other cultures nearby. I started reading the epics when I was able to have money to get access to them in academic versions of these books. And I started seeing how many similarities they were, for example, in the Iliad and the Odyssey to Mahabharat and Ramayana, which are some of the South Indian or South Asian epics. And then I started reading into the Norse ones, like the poetic Edda, not the prose. And I saw that there were certain, again, these things that popped up, and I started looking into comparative mythology, and I realized that there are all these epic beats and tropes across the world that most of them got codified into what we know as the hero's journey, but there's so many more of them that never showed up in that, and you realize a lot of these older epics are very similar, and it started making me wonder, well, why is that? And this gets into the history of the Proto-Indo-European language and the Proto-Indo-Europeans and how they spread around the world. The South Asian language Sanskrit has a root in there. Russian and some of the Baltic languages go there. The Norse, and I was just like, okay, if there's this idea that a lot of the great epics come from the same place, can I do a fantasy that's sort of like that, but then from my culture of a South Asian background? So the first binding is mostly the idea of Ari, who's the protagonist, telling his story, is telling it in a South Asian structure, which is a frame narrative. It was first created there, back and forth, present time and past, and his life, past and present, is emulating bits of fiction from our world as well as mythology from our world. So he's kind of like a new proto hero. He's both familiar and new at the same time. And this was like kind of my love letter to, I guess, like the mythic part of epic fantasy.
That's really cool. And can you elaborate a little bit more on the that notion of the South Asian structure? And was it the framed narrative that you
Yep.
said?
Yep. So the South Asian epics are the oldest records we have a frame narrative in where you have one story going on that sort of serves as the frame, like a door frame or something, and then you have other stories within it. And then you can go as far deep as you want. So we have in mind the present day story, Ari narrating his past life, but then both in the present and in the past, there's also nesting stories. Sometimes a character will perform like a mythological story of the world. Like if you're healing the retelling of the Titanomachy, when the Olympians are throwing down the Titans, you might get a story that's familiar like that, but it's in their world. No different than if in Tolkien's world, Aragorn's telling you about a story from 1,000 years ago. But I actually write out the full story as if you get to see the characters in that timepiece, their recollections being performed for a fictional audience in there, as well as the real time audience that's reading it aloud.
So it sounds like the notes that you were taking before you even probably started writing were quite hefty. Like this must have
Yeah,
been a complicated blueprint.
in terms of the world building, yes, not the narrative. So I'm a pantser. I didn't actually outline this, but what I wanted to do was I knew if I world built off the stories I wanted to tell, like the founding myths, no different than our world. We have myths in many different cultures that we built so much on, and then in the vein of emulating them, we have heroic epics, and then all the way up to present day where we have stories. Some are retellings, some were inspired by that, like Joe Abercrombie's what was it, The Blade Itself. That's a line from the Odyssey. Like little key pieces from cultures around the world have continued to inspire entire new pantheons of fiction. I was like, if I could do that for my world and have this is the origin story of creation and keep making myths, even if the audience doesn't see them, I have so much built up that I could at least play with them and play off of them to what the modern cultures should be around the world.
Very cool. And this is a little cart before the horse, because there's a lot more to dig into here, but I'm just curious about the reaction, like readers who may understand those cultural references. What was the reaction like from those people?
That was really cool. So a lot of it did come at first from blurbs I got where it was other authors who might be more tuned into this or specifically South Asian authors, which was really cool because there's a lot more Easter eggs that if you have a South Asian background, of course, you'll appreciate. Certain food stuff I'm referencing. There's a particular treat in the first binding, which is the equivalent of shaved ice with like shaved and liquid fruit and like fruit syrup put over it. And it's essentially like a snow cone. It's a really popular treat even to this day, particularly with the rose syrup. It's very bad for you because like, it's like 1,000% sugar. But I have like a fantastical version of that, which was really cool that South Asians picked up on that. And then for the mythology, interestingly enough, that was more Western readers who have like an English or mythology background. But I wasn't expecting readers to find that, which was cool that they did because my editors didn't find some of these secrets. Like there's a chapter where a lot of it is written in rhyming couplets and quatrains with normalized prose between it. So it's like a very lyrical story that my main character is telling about the equivalent of Genesis, say, like how the universe began. But nobody really asked why they were these random couplets and quatrains through it. Like, why couldn't it just been normalized prose? And then there's a mini epic poem between it. And an English teacher found out if you delete all the normal prose, all the quatrains and couplets perfectly still work, and the entire chapter becomes an epic poem by perfectly rhyming, and it sticks to the rhyme scheme because the South Asian epics were couplets and quatrains because they were actually epic poems. So that's the reason I chose those two versions and to use couplets and quatrains. But it took an English teacher to figure that out. But it was kind of cool. I'm not gonna lie, it made me really happy that my editors didn't find it, but an English teacher did.
That's amazing. That is very cool. Yeah, and you know what? I now that you describe it that way, I think I remember myself noticing that there was something happening there, but I'm clearly not smart enough to have recognized it for what it was. So that's yeah, that's really cool. And so was that part of your plan all along to be that intentional with the style and the structure of the book?
Yes, I because there's certain references I have to when I was creating let's say some of the cultural myths that are unique to the world, not necessarily South Asian, but they might be larger. I have certain characters who are inspired by the idea of like magic knights, which exist in a lot of cultures. They may not go by the term knight, but like a vanguard force for the celestial or the pure or the good. And I do a lot of things where I capitalize certain words throughout the book repeatedly, and people might not understand why, but there's a reason. Certain repetitions of exact descriptions or sentence structure variances, because I knew that one thing I always loved were my favorite stories had a lot of Easter eggs and secrets within the language themselves. And a lot of old myths did that too. And sometimes I think it's because of translation, that those secrets end up happening, that there's a translation error. So when you go back and find it, it sort of becomes like a secret, but it was never meant to be. And I thought that would be a cool way to play with a story that focuses around a fictional Silk Road, because it's not only relegated to South Asia. For example, like book one takes place in two different timelines, but also two different countries. So along my Golden Road, which is a fictional analog of the Silk Road, there's a country at the far left of the map, the far west, called Itania, which is very similar to like Spain or Portugal. And that's where the present day is taking place because the original Silk Road ended around Old Venetia in Portugal. And then the past takes place in like a South Asian analog. And I knew if I would have different cultures and different languages, I could do a lot of cool wordplay stuff that adds more enrichment to people when they go back and reread it. But they're techniques they might have seen in the old epics, so they're familiar and also rewarding.
Indeed. Yeah. And while you mentioned it, and I'm looking at the map at the beginning of the first binding here as well too. And I love this stuff as well, being a Tolkien fan as well. And it's that added value
Right.
that we get with these kind of books. Was that always part of your plan to include something like this as well too? And
Oh yeah.
how did you quote unquote map that out?
So I actually used a mix of things like Illustrator and like cheap map making software that could auto generate stuff along the boundaries I wanted to create to give me a rough that I could go back and try to better trace in Illustrator. Because those map making softwares are not great for actually creating a real map, but they can give you boundaries and enough that if you can't draw, you can get the shapes of what you want to create. And I had enough of a real working map with distance, um, analogs of the Silk Road, because there's a great book called Silk Roads, plural, A New History of the World by Peter Frankopan, who's like an expert on this. And I use a lot of that study as reference for what was traded along the Silk Road, materials, because I wanted a functional economy to justify why people would trade and travel, because a storyteller often traveled with people at times. They were kind of like the fantasy rock stars. So if you were trading and you were wealthy, you would actually bring a storyteller with you to another country, maybe, and they would regale these people with like stuff from their own world, their own epics and classics, or maybe you never heard of a giraffe before or a lion, and they would tell you about this and entertain you. And it would break the ice and warm people up, maybe make them more amenable to hosting you, to trading better with you, opening doors if this was a lost country, whatever. And I knew that if I had that, I could sort of create enough of a roadmap of the fantasy world I wanted. And then I was very fortunate to work with Priscilla Spencer, who did the official map. Um, and she's done maps for names like Jim Butcher, I think Kevin Hearn, and now she actually works at Dragonsteel for Brandon Sanderson. So I got her before she got scooped up.
Very cool. So this is very complex. Like you must have so much of this going on in your head, and to put this to paper, that it's very impressive. So we are a science fiction podcast, and we do talk about fantasy from time to time. It's something that obviously they go hand in hand. But you have written a space opera,
Yes.
Shepherd of Light. Can you tell us about the process of writing that? Because it, like with what you're describing, your process of writing fantasy, it's so complex. How did writing science fiction come about, and are there going to
Ooh.
be more in that series?
I would like to do more. So that originally started as a very interesting thing. So I started indie self-publishing originally, and my developmental editor, who I still love to this day, Michelle Dunbar, who is a genius editor, she was actually doing really well after starting with me and a few others, like developmentally, and she wanted to start her own publishing house, and she wasn't sure who would give her a book. And I was like, well, you love sci-fi because that's her number one love. I grew up with that. Even before urban fantasy, we didn't touch on that, but it was the closest how I got to Game of Thrones. But the original books I grew up with were SF, because my mom is a huge Star Trek fan. And when before she immigrated from India here, like Star Trek was so prevalent that it was even big over there. So they would have novelizations of like certain episodes and movies, especially by the '90s. She had some of those, and then she came here. I was born here, grew up, and I read through some of her old books as a kid. And then the local library, this was the '90s, so the Star Wars boom was just happening, of like the original expanded universe, like Kevin J. Anderson, Timothy Zahn, David Farland. They just started writing the Courtship of Princess Leia, and they were adding more canon to Star Wars. So they were all over the library. I mean, these were like some of the best selling books alongside Forgotten Realms. So I grew up with a lot of specifically space fantasy. Um, and Star Shepherd was a love letter to that with the first Shepherd of Light, where Michelle wanted a book and she wanted a sci-fi. And I love language. Obviously I speak a few, and then it comes into Tales of Tremaine. So I was like, I want to write something where I specifically can use Western slang just because I love how it sounds. And I wanted to write what kind of world would allow for that. Um, what kind of like economies would it take to function? And I realized Star Wars had sort of done it in a really well way where if you had a concentrated system of wealth, like a galactic empire, doesn't have to be that, but core worlds that have all most of the resources, they would have also the education to go with it. So the further you got out in the system, the less resources you would have, the more rural things would become. Same with technology. And people would also speak maybe in a no nonsense, very similar way to what you would have in a Western. And that sort of justified the creation of that universe around language and education. So I was able to do a really cool blue collar, like ragtag space crew because they come from very far out, and it justified how they speak. And I got to do this just love letter to things like Firefly and Star Wars. And world built it mostly around that. It's just resource allocation. And that changes so much. Like whoever has wealth has access to everything that wealth buys, including good education. And that will change things like speech, how you dress, your attitude and mannerisms, and obviously your core beliefs.
Yeah, there's a lot going on under the surface there. That it doesn't sound
Yeah.
like your typical space opera. I have to go out and get this book as well
It
too.
does
It
on the
sounds
Yeah.
surface. I'm not gonna lie. I still wanted it to be very accessible, so it's gonna feel like Star Wars. It is feeling like you're a bunch of ragtag rebels sticking it to an empire, even though there's more going on. It was completely a pulpy love letter, but I wanted to at least have enough of the bones that people ask why do they talk like that. You can kind of pick that up. Like there's a functioning world behind it, and some of these people were just poor, and they happen to
Hmm.
grow up on the outskirts, and they're just doing what they can.
That's really neat. Well, I wanted to bring it over to the Doors of Midnight.
Mhm.
There, you just announced that there is a new edition coming out.
Yeah.
Tell our listeners about that because it looks beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So the Broken Binding, who was really sweet and kind to also do this with the debut, the first binding. For those who don't know, they're a specialty bookshop in the United Kingdom, and they will buy a select number of books from your publisher over there, and they rebind them. So they'll like change the cover, they'll strip it. Instead of being like a cloth bound, they might make it leatherback or vinyl with gold foil embossing. In the case of the Doors of Midnight, they've got this beautiful like pale gold yellow royal I think it's Royal British or Royal English edition is what they call it, and it's a hardcover that's like leather and vinyl with gold foil embossing, and a normal dust jacket goes over it, and then they spray the actual page edges. So in this case, it's black with a candle emblem put on it, and then they do what I think are called end boards, which when you open the hardcovers, the back and the front, that first sheet that's usually white, they do like a printed stamped design. They come with like tassel bookmarks. They're just like higher collector's editions of books, and they just announced my version today for I think 1,000 copies, and I had to sign all the tip-ins just very recently, so those are good to go.
while we're speaking of that series again, from the earliest descriptions of it, when we just knew him as the storyteller, um, your description of magic or the act of working magic was unique. I don't think I've read anything quite like that before. Yeah, can you describe how you came up with that, or
Absolutely.
were you inspired by, again, something from cultural history?
So a lot of how Ari goes about it comes from cultural history. The magic system itself is kind of multicultural in that a lot of it allows you to interact with the physical world. And a lot of older cultures had this idea of, there's chakra from South Asian history. You have qi or qigong from Chinese, and the idea of elemental influences. Gnostic hermeticism lets you talk about how you can influence the different physical properties of the universe. And then today, I guess, what are the kids calling it? The new age stuff of how like you can, what does it manifest? You can manifest
Mm.
things. This was sort of an idea that's existed all throughout time, and I loved the idea of what if I could bind this with a certain principle. In this case, it's the idea of faith, not religious faith, but your ability to believe within a certain concert of laws that these pairs work together that let you affect different aspects of the world around you. But you have to believe in your ability to do that, and then also believe in your ability to manufacture that specific outcome. And that's really hard to do because belief is tenuous. it can be broken, it can be cultivated in moments of duress. Belief changes you as much as you change yourself to believe certain things. So this magic system has consequences. But Ari's the certain training sequences he goes through in the very beginning of the book to learn how to get in the mindset of that actually come from Asiatic spiritual and mental practices. So there's a huge thing with the idea of candles in here being obviously tied to heroes, like a hero carries a candle, and there's certain reasons for that. But also, there's a meditative exercise that Ari learns called the candle and the flame, where he's meditating on a visual candle with its bulb in the dark, trying to imprint it in his mind, and then play with how many candles he can make, and like emulating following the actual bulb. That's a real meditative exercise called trakta from South Asia. Like candle gazing, you would gaze at a candle for a long time to sort of create like a mental focal point, like your third eye, for visual exercise, a focus exercise, and it actually made its way over to China through Buddhism. When Buddhism started spreading to the world, some Asiatic spiritual practices from India made their way over there, and it actually has shown up later in kung fu movies and stuff of candle gazing and stuff like that, and that's where it originally comes from. So there is some South Asian and other Asiatic practices in how Ari develops his mind to pursue the magic system. But the magic system itself is both unique and both not, in that I took the idea that cultures used to believe you could influence the physical properties of the world, and then I wanted to codify my own system of how you go about that.
Which is a very I think wise approach, because you've taken the best of what history and culture has to offer, and then, as you say, codified it and made it your own. So yeah, yeah, it's nice.
Yeah, I just wanted something where this, I hope this isn't like heretical, but like a lot of times magic of late hasn't felt very magical to me in terms of just the emotional sense, like the reward. Uh
Mm.
like when I read a lot of hard magic now, I'm always figuring out like how is it going to work, because now I know the rules so tightly that it's a science more than a magic, and I've been able to figure out every hard magic system so far, and it takes not some of the reward out, but some of the magical joy out. And I use those like
Mm.
separately for that reason, because there is something I believe called a sense of wonder, which existed in a lot of older novels of just sometimes something could be wondrous for the sake of being wondrous, and like it's just cool. And I wanted my magic system to have that sort of edge in terms of not only do you work with it, but I don't want the audience to know 100% how it works until Ari figures it all out. So you learn it with him, but throughout the entire books, there are enough clues if you go back and reread with new knowledge and piece, you could piece together that from book one, it has been apparent how they work, including the flaws and what you can do around it. But if you figure that out later with more books, it becomes more apparent, but it doesn't ever take away, hopefully, the sense of wonder that I want to hopefully emotionally evoke.
Again, a very smart approach, I think, and it reminds me of a very popular and frustrating experience that I think many of us in the fandom have, and that was the introduction of the idea of
Many
midichlorians to
chlorines. Yep.
the Force,
I knew you were going there.
which,
That I'm not
yeah,
gonna lie. Yes.
no, of course. Well, it's the one that stands out, right? And I think we all sort of had that collective groan of like,
Why?
you
Yeah.
know, God, I love you, but what is this?
What is this? Because when Yoda first explained it in Empire, it was the coolest thing ever. Like luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. And he talks about the Force binding everything, and then he demonstrates it by lifting the X-wing, and you're like, that's so numinous and ethereal, and it made the Force seem even larger than what we already knew. And I'm like, that's cool. And
Yeah.
then Midi-chlorians, and it's like, why?
Yeah, suddenly it's physical and scientific and
Yeah,
explainable, and yeah, it's that was a little misstep, but so be it.
You're just putting out your latest book. What is coming in the future? You've got to be working on some other stuff, whether it's just
yeah.
notes for possible books, or are you in deep to the another book right now?
So I'm actually doing the final drafting for book three, so I can start it next month. I'd like to have it turned in by, I think, February, early 2025 is what they said on the contract. So I'm hoping February is acceptable. Because I'm gonna probably start machine gunning it out like July, 4,000 words a day, and then I taper down. So like the first month will knock out 120,000 words, which is like a third, and then the next 2 months will knock out like another third, and then I go even slower. And the last 3, 4 months of the year will go out to finishing the last third, so I get a break to breathe. Right now, I have a thriller novel on submission. I started a new pen name because I wanted to have my, not my eggs all in one basket. Because right now we're seeing that, for example, a lot of things like romantasy and cozy are being bought, and fantasy is sort of, I'm not really sure, but like agents seem worried versus like how much fantasy is selling versus romantasy and cozy. And I'm just trying to be prudent in that I want to keep writing, and I have the Promised Book 3 to do, but I want to flex more muscles and try other stuff. So I've
When
got
you
the
say
thriller arcs.
cozy, are you referring to like the Travis Baldry kind of the cozy
Yeah, yeah,
side of
yeah. The whole idea of it, yeah, cozy fantasy specifically, I should have specified because I know there's like cozy mysteries and those have been a thing for a while. Yeah, there's definitely like just that kind of cozy specific fantasy, like Legends and Lattes. A lot of acquisitions have been going through there. A lot of agents have been asking for that. Like, can you write a cozy? Can you write something like that book? And I don't know if it's just indicative of a market genre change, but some agents have been really stressing that, and I don't know if that's going to affect things more. So just trying to be prudent. I'm experimenting. I've got a South Asian horror idea I've been tingling with, and then also a another fantasy that's a standalone that we'll see if Tor wants to buy. That's inspired by Portuguese colonization of India, but it's a secondary fantasy world. So it's not Portugal, it's not India. It's just the idea of what happens when one maritime nation takes over an island city state of a different culture and then play with that.
What tell us a little bit too about what when you first started discovering the genres that you are successful in now as well too. Who did you gravitate to? Who were the writers that inspired you, and who
Oh,
are you digging today?
so the earliest fantasy specifically I could think of is R.A. Salvatore, because again, the 90s, before I found Tolkien or anybody else, this was all the new stuff, right? Like Legends of Dritz was absolutely dominating the charts, Forgotten Realms. I've read probably every R.A. Salvatore book from his Highwayman series. I think Demon Wars, obviously Dritz and everything he's done there. And that led me backwards to Tolkien, who I absolutely adore. He was probably one of the largest inspirations to Tales of Tremaine of how I do my world building, because he's one of the first fantasy authors I can think of who continually used mythic sources. A lot of the Lord of the Rings comes from the poetic Edda, and then the Finnish epic, the Kalevala, um, and to the point where there's a lot of similar beats and plot ideas from them. And I just love that he was able to do that, but he made it very British. He sort of created a new pantheon of British mythology because at that time everything was mostly Arthurian until he came up with Lord of the Rings. That's what the focus was on. And so once I'd found Tolkien, that kind of started a rabbit hole of me finding that kind of epic fantasy more from Swords and Sorcery, where it became Robert Jordan, George R. R. Martin, and then I started finding my way backwards to like really obscure authors like Hope Mirrlees, who I think is older than Tolkien, and she wrote a book called Blood in the Mist, which is a very early kind of fairy story about a neighboring fairy city or kingdom where there's some xenophobia going on around the town folks of you don't deal with fairies because their food is dangerous, they're poisonous, addicting, they can ruin your life. And it was very high concept for the time it came out, because I think it predates Lord of the Rings, if I remember correctly. And finding just more now stories based off of that sense of wonder I was telling you about, when people fantasy as a genre wasn't as codified as much, so people were writing really weird, surreal stuff, but everything felt magical.
Can you tell me
Yeah.
the author's name? That
Oh, Hope Mirrlees. I might be saying it wrong because I don't know if it's Mir or Merlis, but if you look up Blood in the Mist, she should pop up. Hope Mirrlees. Okay, maybe I said it wrong. It's
got
Mirrlee.
it.
Yeah,
Release. Okay.
1926. So yes, older than Lord of the Rings, I think.
Wow. Okay. No. So that's I've been looking for something like that. And my partner as well, Miranda, who helps us out on the show sometimes, mainly to talk about fantasy. Um, I'm a sci-fi guy through and through. I pick up the odd fantasy and I enjoy it. However, Lord of the Rings are my favorite books, and I don't know why and how that happens because I know that people can be kind of hard on Terry Goodkind. I kind of enjoyed that first book, even though
Yeah,
I think I read the first two, but that first book, it kind of is just, it's the hero's quest. It's
yeah,
it's it's Star Wars in fantasy world. I still enjoyed it. It's fun.
yeah.
Um, and then In the Name of the Wind, I really enjoyed that. The writing's really good. And the second one I liked even more. But yeah, I Tolkien, I can't describe it. I listened to it audiobook for the first time this Christmas, just to try that out because I've read it a couple of times and I was listening to it and I feel like I could do it again next Christmas, or this
Mhm.
Christmas. It's so can you recommend something for me? I'm definitely going to be checking out your fantasy. Can you
Oh, thank
recommend
you.
something to our listeners that's going to get us excited about fantasy since we do read so much science fiction?
Oh wow, I was actually going to give you a science fiction recommendation, but you might already know it. That treads the way of fantasy in a way to me, but just to get it out, if people don't know about Gene Wolfe, I'm assuming hardcore sci-fi
Yeah,
readers do, but not everybody does, because his story with Severian. Oh
yeah.
my God, how did I just blank on the name of that series? Wow.
The Torturer and The Shadow of the Torturer.
Shadow of the Torturer, yes. Those are
I'm
brilliantly
not smart enough for those books, man. I gotta try them again because they
that's why
lose me a
they're
bit.
brilliant though. Like
Yeah,
there's so much subtle references in them.
they're
There's
really
something I
are.
was gawking over where he was talking about these warriors with these banners of white armor and gold visors and these battle standards of like their houses, and you realize those were astronauts. Like the gold visor was an astronaut helmet, and he's talking about like guys with flags for their countries. They weren't
Yeah,
battle standards,
yeah,
and there's so much beautifulness of in his world and writing that it reads like a fantasy, even though it's like this dying age sci-fi. Um,
yeah.
but for fantasy, oh man, I read some really weird stuff. So up on my shelf, actually, I can see that there's a book by a guy named John Bruner called Traveler in Black. It's a very small book, very weird, kind of a cosmic fantasy. That's something I really loved, and something else that has inspiration in Tales of Tremaine, because he has a character whose cloak is like literally made of like the galaxy. It's like this dark swath of space, and he has a staff of curdled moonlight, and he's kind of just this omniscient magical traveler character. Like there was a lot of weird stuff in the 80s. I think that if people bother to dig into, they might really get a really nice love of fantasy. One that might still be obscure for some is the Dark Elf trilogy by R.A. Salvatore, because it's not the present day canon with Dritz. It follows his father Zach Nefian, if I said his name right, but it was
Mm.
inspired by The Godfather, where Salvatore was like, I wanted to write dark elves with the Godfather. So there's a lot of really cool interhouse politics and stuff that might seem familiar, like with Game of Thrones, but done in an underground, cavernous environment with dark elves, which is not something like a combination you see often. And I think just for wanting to reinvigorate or renew how fantastical fantasy could be, that's a great pick.
You said John Brunner. Is it the same John Brunner of Shockwave Writer and
Ah,
Stand on Zanzibar?
they might actually be, yes.
Because I've
Because
never read his fantasy, but I have read a couple of his books, and Shockwave Writer is kind of Philip K. Dickish, and kind of that's a weird way to say that.
yeah, but I get what
Um,
you're saying. Yeah. I because
uh,
this is new because I didn't actually know his sci-fi work. So this is actually really great that if we hit it off on that and it turns out I've got other stuff to read by him and that you could read a fantasy by him. Yep,
um,
same guy. You're right.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
I never knew that because I never found those books of him because I found him
yeah.
through like thrift shops because I actually go looking for old like classic
That
books out of print that I might not know of.
Me too,
Like
me too.
and I found that and I fell in love with Traveler in Black. I'm like, this is weird and
Okay,
very cool. But I
I'll
didn't know
check
he
that
had
out.
other things.
No, John Brenner's really neat. We actually had a guest, Damien Walter, on the show who I got maybe this is a bit of a reach here, but I believe it was his friend has John Brenner's one of John Brenner's typewriters and paid quite a bit for it.
Wow.
But he's much more known in the UK than he is over here. I think a lot of people know him from Shockwave Writer, which would predate kind of Neuromancer and be a little bit
Wow. I
more
didn't actually know that either.
cyberpunkish in the late
Ooh.
70s.
That's
But
cool though.
well,
Well,
I'm gonna check out the fantasy that you've recommended too by him because we'll do a little crossover here. You
yeah,
come,
yeah.
we'll
Because I want to read this so bad now. If he's a predecessor to Gibson, because I never knew about that. Because he usually gets a lot of the credit of like the first like wave with cyberpunk, but it's cool hearing that somebody did something like earlier.
yeah.
I need to check that out.
I do find it interesting though that so many people say Gibson was the the first cyberpunk novel, or Neuromancer was the first novel of that sort. When you really look back at Blade Runner, well, that was two
Yeah,
years before the book even came out,
you're right. The short
and
story. Yeah,
Blade Runner, that film looks so cyberpunk, and
yeah,
that's before Neuromancer came out, which is apparently the first cyberpunk book.
yeah. There's the aesthetic that's so key to it. Like I know for a lot in the culture, Akira was so
Yeah.
foundational for that, and then Ghost in the Shell also.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, one of the best.
Hey, I got to ask. This is a
Mm.
little aside, but maybe relevant as well too. You've mentioned R.A. Salvatore a couple of times now too. So does that mean that part of your formative experience was gaming as well too? Were you a D&D
Yes,
player
yes, yeah,
as
yeah.
well as a reader? Because I
Oh,
was as well too, and I tell me if your experience was the same. I credit a lot of that game in my formative years as instilling that love of storytelling.
mhm. Oh, absolutely. Especially because like when you're younger, If you don't get to play, you're always going to be DM. Uh, so a lot of impromptu stuff was I would sort of help being DMing at times for somebody older than me if I didn't get a seat at the table, which unfortunately, that is something that happens to kids. Not enough room, not enough players, or somebody needs help. So I ended up DMing a lot more, and then I sort of still take that role when I play now because I always try to find ways to break the DM because I know how DM and storytelling work. And I'm like, okay, there's a plot hole here. Can I get out of this? And then I keep forgetting that some DMs can go like, I will kill you if you keep trying to mess up my story. And then I just obviously just take that back to writing your own works. If a character does that to you, I will kill you if you do not get out of the way of my story. But definitely formative with that, as well as Pathfinder. And then obviously the video games that spurred up with them because I guess I was lucky enough to have like the golden age of when RPGs were blowing up. So Baldur's Gate 2, Diablo, anything that had even like sort of nods to Forgotten Realm-esque or D&D like aspects to them, they were just blowing up from the 2000s. I mean, still to present day because we just had the Baldur's Gate 3 game come out.
Yeah, I was well, I've got a few years on you, but I was a big Dragonlance guy back in the day.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Those were
Yep.
foundational for me when I was a
Margaret
teenager.
Weiss
Margaret
and
Weiss, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
and
Tracy
Tracy
Hickman.
Tracy Hickman.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And the modules. I don't think I ever even played the modules, but I have them all still, and they're fantastic. But
Oh yeah.
yeah, it's funny, and it's funny to see the game have such a resurgence today where back in the day it was this brand of irredeemable nerdhood, but now
And
it's
that's
so mainstream.
weird. Yeah, because like I grew up at a time where D&D wasn't as mocked, so I missed. I mean,
Mm,
it's kind of sad in a way because like for me it's so weird to hear that it was ever mocked because it was always just cool when I was coming up, right? Like you
mm.
find out about 10, Diablo 2 was one of the biggest games in the world at the time. Everybody was into fantasy. Magic the Gathering was getting more normalized. Like I guess that might have still been weird when I was a kid, but not where I grew up. Like there was like local yard sales and people were selling magic cards all the time. Like it was just one of those things. Everybody had them. And then Pokemon, the trading cards blew up. So the idea of trading card games themselves are getting very normalized by very big pop culture things. And it just seemed like, oh, this is normal. Which one do I want to pick? Because Pokemon, Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh came out. Then there's the tabletop games. And yeah, it's so odd hearing that at one time people were hurt and ostracized for it. And I've heard the stories, but it's still, there's a dissonance of like, this has always been cool. Why?
Well, and that was on top of if you could break through the curtain of shame and nerdhood, then there was the Satanic Panic on top of it, which was just a whole other level of interesting times. I'll leave it at that.
Love the 80s. I was brought up by Christian parents in the 80s, so I know all
Uh,
about that one.
Ronnie, is there anything else we haven't touched on that upcoming work? I know we've talked a bit about that, but stuff we haven't mentioned that you wanna get on the soapbox about.
Oh, wow, I can't think of anything right now. I'm just trying to crank stuff out. Like I do have another short story that'll be coming out for my urban fantasy. It's going to be in Jim Butcher's next anthology, Paranormal Payback, for people who like urban fantasy in Dresden. He's going to be doing New Dresden stuff. I'm going to be doing stuff for my urban fantasy world in that. And then I just was featured in Grimdark magazine, which I'm really happy about because they actually did a entirely South Asian edition only. And they featured really, really cool stories. And we actually got to make some history there because my story was
Cool.
selected for the cover, but it's the first time in Western publishing Punjabi Sikhs with like the beard and the turban have ever been featured on SFF, like for a cover. So that was
Amazing.
actually pretty cool that to get that to happen. Yeah.
So, can you tell our listeners when the new book comes out and
Oh,
where they should buy it and where they can follow you on any social medias and your website and stuff?
yeah, thank you. So, The Doors of Midnight comes out August 13th in the States. And I'm really bad at math, but I think a few days later, whatever that same Thursday is of that week is when it comes out in the UK because they launch books on Thursdays there. And it's available everywhere for pre order. But if you're in the States or North America, I actually partnered with a bookstore called Loyalty Books in Washington, D.C. And they have a special place on their website where if you pre order, the books will be signed because they're having me in like a week or two early when they first get stocked so we can make sure we can at least get everyone a signed hardcover that wants it from them. In the UK, if people want signed hardcovers, the Broken Binding and Goldsboro are doing specialized editions where if you order through them, you get the special hardbacks that we talked about, but those will also be signed. And then, oh, right, where to follow me. Most active on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram under the same tag, RR Virdi. Like just that will pull up me.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. We really
Yeah,
appreciate you
Thanks
stopping
for
by.
having me.
Yeah. And we love connecting with people down the road too, and mixing authors together, getting people to chat together and do different things. So we'll connect with you in the future sometime. And
Oh, absolutely.
all the best with the new book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ronnie, for joining us today. That was a lot of fun. We hope you enjoyed that one. If you did, go back and check out other episodes. We talked to so many amazing authors and filmmakers, and we chat books and movies. Just go back and check some older episodes. You might like what you see. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time.